All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get kicked off here. Happy Monday, everyone. Just a couple really quick announcements for today. So we're in module 7 and week 15 of the program, if you can believe that or not. Today marks the start of the intro to Server Side Javascript Programming with Node.js and making your own APIs. That'll cover weeks 15, 16, and 17. So for the next 3 weeks. So week 15, you'll have Max for this week with your teaching assistant being Karen Thorne. And then weeks 16 and 17, your main instructor will be Gus Cost, and Kelly Corey will be the teaching assistant for weeks 16 and 17. So just really quick, just level set where everyone's at. So with that, we do have a guest speaker joining us for tonight, David Voorhees. So Dave is the computer science department chair at Lemoyne College. As all of you know, sorry, I just muted myself, one of our amazing partners as part of Erie 21. He worked in the industry for 19 years before he joined Lemoyne College in 1999, and I'll let him give the full intro here in a minute. But his presentation is Creating Beautiful Code, and I'll drop some links in the chat in a minute in the Zoom if you'd like to follow the presentation, and he has a couple of code samples that he'll be going over today. So without further ado, please join me in a big virtual Zoom round of applause for Dave, and I'll hand it over for you, Dave, to take it away.
Thanks, Jesse. Great to be here. I am going to share my screen and then we'll get started. So, as Jesse mentioned, the topic, oops, sorry about that. The topic is creating beautiful code. You can see the agenda there. I'm not really going to talk much about myself. I just soon get right into the topic, if you don't mind. And so I'm going to start off by making an assertion, expressing an opinion that I have, and then we'll do some discussion questions, hopefully get some of your opinions out there, and then we'll dive a little deeper into my opinions, and I'll have, as Jesse mentioned, I've got a few coding examples just to illustrate some of the concepts I'm talking about. So in my opinion, writing beautiful code is important, and maybe I should say very important here. And so I'd like to take a few minutes and get your reaction to these 3 questions that I've posed here. Do you think writing beautiful code is important, and why? So what opinion would you have about that? When you're writing code, do you have an audience, right? And so if you think you do have an audience when you're writing code, who would that audience be? We certainly all are familiar with, I think, creating and doing presentations, and knowing your audience when you do a presentation is certainly very important. And then the third question is, if we all agree that writing beautiful code is important, what does it mean to write beautiful code? What do we need to think about? So I'll open this up. Any comments, opinions you have about any of those 3 questions would be wonderful.
Feel free to come off mute, anyone, or you can throw your comments and thoughts in the chat. Dave, I don't know if you can see the chat, but I'll kind of...
Yeah, I just brought up, thanks. I just brought up the window.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I like the 2 comments that are out there so far. Someone's asking about definition of beautiful code, so I'll get into that when I get into some more of the details about my opinion. Beautiful code is readable code. I like that one a lot too. Makes easier for other developers to understand. Absolutely, that's another great comment. What about, let's see. What about the third question there? What does it mean to create beautiful code? Anybody have any specific ideas or suggestions about how you might go about doing that? I like the comment about coding as an art. Absolutely, it's as much art as it is science. I absolutely agree with that. Formatting? Yeah, certainly. Formatting code, I think, is very important. A little more challenging when you're putting code into a presentation. So I took some liberties and removing some formatting that normally I would have in my code just to present it nicely. Less code. Planning using BEM. So I don't know what BEM is. Could you explain what that acronym means, please?
Mel, you want to go off mute and explain what that means?
Right, technology. We live in a world of acronyms, and that one I'm not familiar with. Block element modifier. SAS. Okay. Yep. I think I getbam.com naming. Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. Let's move on. So the answer I have here is really, I guess you would say, from a business perspective. And that is, by and large, it's going to cost more to maintain a software product than it is to initially build it or develop it. And certainly any software product that's been around for multiple years and goes through an evolution with many software versions, the maintenance costs associated with that software is going to be far higher than the initial development cost. As you're all, I think, experiencing now, developing software is a labor-intensive operation, right? This is not easy stuff to do. Imagine starting from scratch and building your own word processor software that does similar things to whatever Microsoft Word does, or whatever other word processor package you might happen to use. Those are incredibly large pieces of software. Clearly takes a relatively large team of people to develop. So those development costs are very high. Nonetheless, if that word processing software is going to stick around for many, many years, it's going to be modified. Defects are going to be fixed. Maybe software vulnerabilities are going to be removed. All that takes significant time. And as we all know, time is money. So writing beautiful code is going to help you, your project team, your organization minimize those maintenance costs. So the sidebar there, that's sort of a hard lesson to learn, right? There's always things we can do to improve software. I've never seen a piece of software that's perfect. There's always something that could be improved from a usability perspective or maybe functional perspective. And then there's almost always defects or vulnerabilities in software products. So in terms of the audience, I think we had a chat comment about that. Absolutely, the audience is other developers. That's who you're writing code for. You're not really writing code for yourself. You're not writing code for the compiler, the interpreter, or the browser, or any other type of computing environment you might be using. It's the other humans in the equation that matter. And so we had chat comments talking about formatting. Absolutely, that's very important. And someone said short or make it easy to understand. All of that's very important. So let's get right to my definition of what it takes to create beautiful code. So the first couple of bullets here, I think, are pretty easy, self-explainable. Certainly, when you name things in your code, those names should be descriptive. They should be meaningful. Using X and Y as your variable names, for example, is a crappy way to do things, even though you see that a lot in various tutorials that you might find on the web. So identifier names sort of describe all the different types of names that we could potentially create and use in our code. And there's some examples there. Comments are certainly important, but in my view, right, having too many comments can also be a detriment to beautiful code. And so there's a balance here. I'm a big fan of very short, very concise comments. If I'm reading a paragraph of comments for 3 lines of code, I'm getting upset because there's likely going to be more mistakes in your paragraph of comments than there are in those 3 lines of code. You know, if you update and modify your code, you really should update and modify the comments to reflect those changes. And unfortunately, in industry, that's not always done. But the main point of my talk is that last main bullet. There are 3 program design criteria, and this is what I'm going to focus on with the coding examples that we'll go through in just a minute. So the 3, as you can see, separation of concerns, design for reuse, design only what is needed. All 3 of these are very important criteria that we use extensively at Lemoyne to help evaluate student work and for students to evaluate their own work and work of other students. So you can see here, the definitions I'm providing for each of these 3 program design criteria is focused on the style of programming that you've learned with JavaScript on the client side, and that is, by and large, you're just defining and using functions to do your work. I could change the definitions here if we're doing object-oriented programming or other types of programming using other programming paradigms. And so each function that you define and use should only do one thing. And that can be tricky in terms of what we mean by that. So again, we'll look at the examples in a minute. Design for reuse tends to be the most challenging aspect of this. How do you create functions that are more general purpose, but yet still help you solve the problem? And so by general purpose, what we mean there is the function can be called under slightly different circumstances and it still meets your needs. And then design only what is needed. For some of you, that may be challenging because maybe we were taught that it's important to do more than what you're asked to do, right? And I think in terms of software development, if you have a set of requirements you're looking to fulfill, you should fulfill those requirements and only those requirements. If you add extra stuff to your software that's not required, you've essentially made it more challenging for someone else to maintain that code because the code is bigger. And I think we had small code as one of the comments in the chat room as well. So here's a really, really small example. You can see the picture on the left. So basically there's just the ability for someone to enter in a year value and then a credit card number value. And you can see the HTML there. The one thing I want to point out is that validate data is this JavaScript function that's going to be called when the user clicks on the submit button. And as we all know, hopefully by now, with the onSubmit attribute of the form tag, if that function returns a false, then the submit actually never happens. And the client just sits there and waits for the user to do something to either fix the problem or maybe hit the back button and do something else entirely. And so this very small example is really just going to do a couple of very simple validation checks on the 2 data values that are entered on this form. And that's all we're going to do here in the example. So on the left, we've got a single function called validate data. Again, that's what's being called by the browser when the user clicks on the submit button. And so you can see here that we're getting the data value entered for the year. We're getting the data value entered for the credit card number. And then we've got a couple of if statements here making sure the year value is correct. So if it does not have exactly 4 characters or digits in it, it's bad. If it has exactly 4 characters or 4 digits in it, then we try to convert that value to a number. If the year is not a number, then it's bad. And then we're doing essentially the same thing with credit card number. The length has to be 16. If the length is 16, then we try to convert it to a number. If it's not a number after that conversion, then again, we have an error. And I apologize here. I changed the font size on the error message just so I could make this thing fit and show the proper formatting. I thought about switching to the IDE that I use, but I figured I'd just keep everything on the Google slide. So result is initialized to true. You can see at the end we're returning result. And so what this logic is doing, the strategy here from the user experience, user interface perspective is to show as many error messages as we can with one alert. And so we keep on adding to the error message. So you can see here, if the year value is wrong, it's going to say year must contain 4 digits, new line character. If the credit card number is also bad, it's going to use string concatenation and add the credit card number must contain 16 digits. And so if the error message length is greater than 0, we know we have at least one error that we discovered. We set result to false and display the error message. So that's the validate data. On the right-hand side, I go through a fairly quick assessment of what I think about this function. And so from a separation of concerns perspective, this is a crappy function. This function is doing way more than one thing, right? So it's validating year, that's one thing. It's validating credit card, that's 2 things. It's determining what type of error messages to display, that's 3 things. It's formatting those error messages. And so it's doing way more than just one thing. And so that's bad from a separation of concerns perspective. The design for reuse criteria, this function is likely not going to be useful to us for any other code or any other app. It's very specific to this form, right? We know we have a year text box on the form, we need to validate it. We know we had credit card number on the form, we need to validate it. So it's very much tied to this form, and it's hard to see how we could reuse validate data in any other app. And then design only what is needed. This seems to be appropriate in terms of that particular criteria. It is doing some simple validation on the client side within the browser, making sure that when we do send the post to the server, that at least the year value would be 4 digits and the credit card number would be 16 digits. And it's likely that on the server side, you would be doing additional validation to check other things. But I won't talk about that at all. So we need to improve this. It's not good from separation of concerns. It's not good from the design for reuse perspective. So let's first tackle and redesign this function, validate data, based solely on trying to improve separation of concerns. So I apologize for the colors here. I prefer not to use a lot of colors, but I thought it would make sense here. So the statements in green have to do with validating year, and the statements in orange have to do with validating credit card number. And so our strategy here from a separation of concerns perspective is let's take all the statements in green and put those in a separate function. And the validate data code will call that new function. And we'll do the same thing with the statements that are in orange that deal with validation of credit card number. So on the left, I have the original validate data from example 1. On the right, I have my rewritten validate data, which is my second example. And so you can see here, there's a lot less code shaded green in example 2 that's dealing with validating year. Similarly, validating credit card number, a lot less code in the validate data function. And the other thing you can see is that we are calling a function called validate year and a function called validate credit card number. And we are simply passing to it the value from the appropriate text box using the document object. Yeah, so let's move on. So then here's all three functions for the second example. So again, this was addressing separation of concerns. So here we see the validate data, where we're calling separate functions to validate either the year or credit card number. And then over on the right, we see the function for validate year with the formal parameter called year. We see the function validate credit card number with the formal parameter called credit card number. These statements inside really match the original logic that was in validate data. We're checking to make sure the length is correct, and we're checking to make sure that what they entered is essentially a number. And we're doing the same thing with credit card number. Of course, the length is 16 instead of 4. Other than that, it's the same exact logic. The other thing that we've done, and this is kind of subtle here, right? When I think about writing these functions on the right, validate year and validate credit card number, I want to write these without thinking about or caring about which order they will be called, right? So again, my strategy was I want to display as many error messages as possible in a single alert pop-up window. And so I want to have those error messages displayed nicely line by line. And so I want to add a new line character, which we can see over in the validate data. If the year is invalid, we know error message is going to contain some text. The if statement for error message.length will be true. And so we add a new line character. I'm doing that over here in validate data. I'm not doing that in validate year for the sole reason that the validate year and validate credit card number function should not care what order they are called in. They should still work. And so we can flip-flop the statement in green and the statement in orange, and this will still work exactly as we expect because I've got my new line logic here inside validate data. So this is certainly better from a separation of concerns perspective, right? Each of these functions now is doing one distinct thing. So I think it's clear that validate year, the only thing it's doing and the only thing it's responsible for is validating the year, similar with validate credit card number. But if we come over here to validate data, right? Could we argue that this is still too complex? I suppose we could, right? And so I'm not going to go down that path at all. I'm done with separation of concerns. But if I was really getting picky about the separation of concerns criteria, I might do some additional work with that validate data function. But for now, I'm going to say I'm happy with that. Validate data is essentially doing one thing, which is it's the method being called by the submit logic so that we can validate all the data on the form. Design for reuse, if we re-look at that and we focus on validate year and validate credit card number, you just look at the structure of this code and it's almost identical, right? Clearly, the one difference is we're referencing the parameter variable year here. We're referencing the parameter variable credit card number over here. But other than those differences, and the other difference is how many digits or characters must be entered to make that value valid. That's different. But other than those two things, there's a lot of similarity between these two. So really, our next example is going to focus on design for reuse and create a different function that will do validation of these two values slightly differently. So here's our third example. On the left, I've got the validate data from example 2. And on the right, I've got my validate data function for the third example, where again, I'm focusing on design for reuse. And so you look at the statements in green, and they match up in terms of validating year or validating credit card number. So now if we look at example 3, you can see that in both cases, we're calling the same function called validate number. And if we look at that function call, we're passing the value of year, a comma, and then we're passing the value 4, which we know would be the number of digits that are required for a year. And then the second call to validate number is passing the credit card number value, and then the value 16. And so the changes really to validate data are really somewhat minimal. But if we look at validate number, we see now we have 2 parameter variables: data, which is the value we want to validate, and then the valid length, which tells us how many digits or characters should be in that data value. So other than that, this logic is very similar to what we saw for validate year and validate credit card number functions. Just now it's more general. We can pass any data to it that's supposed to be a series of digits, as long as we know how many digits are required. If it's a fixed number of digits, so federal tax ID number, social security number, there's a whole bunch of numbers that would have a fixed length to it. We could use the same validate number function and validate any of those numeric values entered by a user. So this third example, we did a better job with separation of concerns. Each function is essentially doing one distinct thing, designed for reuse. We now have this very generic validate number function, which we could clearly use for other apps. Maybe in the same app, right, we have a bunch of text fields where they're typing in numbers, and so we just keep on calling validate number to make sure the data value entered by the user is correct. And so with that, I'll wrap this up. I think I went a little over, Jesse, but if you have time for any questions, happy to address any questions that people might have or comments.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dave. We'll carve out a couple minutes for questions here for Dave. So if you have questions, anyone, feel free to take yourself off mute or throw them in the chat, and I can read out the questions to Dave. Any questions for Dave? Feel free to take yourself off mute or throw them in the chat.
So you can see my contact info there. If you want to send me an email at some point, feel free to do that. I just ask that you identify yourself as participating in Careers in Code. That way I won't think that your email is spam and I'll actually reply to you. So was this, I'm kind of curious here, was this new information? Was this a review of stuff you've talked about in the past? Combo, 50-50. Okay, good. Well, thanks for your time. And thanks for the invite, Jesse.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. And if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to Dave, if that's all right, Dave. Just for
that's fine.
Folks can reach out.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight, Dave. I really appreciate you taking the time, and have a great rest of your night, Dave.
Yeah, thanks. Everybody have a good evening as well. Enjoy the storm.
Thanks, Dave. All right. With that, I'll hand it over to Max. And feel free to kick off, and everyone have a great class and great rest of your night.
Hello. You've got me back. Aren't you guys lucky? Totally kidding. As tradition, when I teach, I'd like to kick it off with the stand-up. How are we feeling about React? What are things that you've learned? What are things that you like? What are things that you hate about it? What was the last module like? Don't all talk at once. Dominique, good feedback on just needing JavaScript practice. I think that comes with time. The good news is we are not abandoning JavaScript anytime soon. We will be covering that more and more, and that's just, you know, practice with typing the syntax and all of that. It's just something that kind of happens with time. Reusable components are a game changer. I worked on a feature today. We use React at work, and I had 800 lines of code that I did not have to write because of a reusable component that I had already else somewhere in the software. So really, really helpful to have reusable components. And when you get good at structuring your React code, it is amazing how you can just take a little piece of code that you've written somewhere else and go, oh, I can reuse this over here. And so typically when you start a new project at work, if your team is large enough, the first step in starting to build out your application isn't diving in and building out page by page. It's actually coming up with a library of components of saying, okay, we're going to use this button, you know, all over the site. So we should make our one button and make that reusable component so that when we do start building out those pages, we can kind of pluck from our component library instead of having to make everything kind of just in time, just when we need it. So React is super helpful for those reusable components for sure. How are we feeling about state? Someone want to give me a summary of what state is, or why we use state, or how state is different than a variable? It's a piece of a value. Yep. How is state different from a variable in JavaScript? What's special about state that variables don't do? You can set state. You can set state inside of a class, but you can set a variable, right? So that doesn't make state anything unique. You can do it inside of a class. You can do it inside of a function component, but you could set a variable inside a class as well. Hooks, Brandy, I think you're on the right track. Shaw, you said state can be changed. Variables can be changed. Can set state, you can update state, you can set a variable, you can update a variable. So Carolyn, I think you're closest there, although Brandy, you're also right in that it uses hooks, right? So the big thing with using state is that when we update our state, our HTML automatically updates for us. So if we wrote out some React code and just used the regular variable, and then say on our on change button, or on our on click, when you click that plus button in your homework assignment, if we just use the regular variable, the counter actually wouldn't increase. It would add 1 to the number, but the HTML would stay the same. So the beauty of using state, and use state happens to use a hook in the functional components, is that it updates our HTML for us. So one thing that we're going to be doing this week is going back to our chat app. And we are going to go through and rebuild all of that in React. And so you can get a feel of how messages work. And then we're going to layer in our backend and actually send messages to each other and all be able to see each other's messages as they come through. So I'm hoping the short-term game plan over the next couple of days, and we'll see how long it takes us, is we're going to do a little calculator where we're just going to send 2 numbers from our front end to our back end. Our back end are going to add those 2 numbers together and send that result down to our front end. We will be using React in all of our front end code from here on out, just so you guys get practice creating them, having them running locally, kind of starting from scratch, all of that fun stuff. From there, we are going to follow a traditional path of how a professional developer would work. So it's very common at work to have a different front-end developer from your back-end developer. So your back-end developer is going to get the spec first, right? The project requirements, and they're going to build out all the endpoints for you. And so those endpoints or routes or URLs or however you want to think of them, thinking all the way back to the module with Gus and you know how you could send information to the student and the teacher and kind of see that information. We're going to be building something similar. And so the backend spec often gets done first, gets all coded out. They hand it to a front-end developer. The front-end developer then goes out and builds the entire user interface around all of that. We're going to be doing that in React. And then comes the integration step of kind of layering in that backend functionality into our front end and getting them connected. And so I want you guys to interrupt me whenever I use a word that you're not familiar with, that you are familiar with, but would like the definition again, anything like that. So we want to think of let's go over a stack again, right? There are all kinds of different stacks that you can use. We are talking about stacks for a web app, a web application. So your mobile stack is going to be a little different, right? If you're creating an app for iPhone or Android, that is going to use a different stack, especially on the front end, because it's written in a different language. But when we're talking about a web stack, we're talking about three major components. We're talking about the front end, which we happen to be teaching React. Hopefully you guys are starting to feel a little bit more comfortable with that. We're talking about the back end, and the back end server that we're going to be using is called Node. And you guys, I know I've been exposed to Node a little bit already, Node.js. We're going to be using a framework on our back end called Express. Express is by far the most popular back end framework. It's just going to give us some functionality that would be a little bit more verbose to write out if we were using plain vanilla Node without Express. And then finally, the third piece of the stack is your database. And so for your database, we're going to be teaching a language called SQL, structured query language or standard query language, can't remember off the top of my head. And we are going to be using a database called Postgres, Postgres. There was a slight change to the order of the modules, the way we're teaching them. And we did this in cohort 1, and it took until last Friday for me to realize that we should probably shake it up a little bit. But we're going to do a week of Node now with me. And so we're going to go through the basic hello world, kind of getting started, understanding endpoints, all of that stuff. Then we are going to switch over to the database module for 2 weeks. And you're going to learn all about data modeling and getting your server connected and running queries and getting your database server and your node server talking to each other. You're going to learn concepts called an ORM, an object relational mapper, and how we can take our data and map it into JavaScript objects so we can work with it more easily in JavaScript. Gus is going to take both of those weeks and take you all through the database. And then it's going to come back to me for the final 2 weeks of Node.js. The reason why we split it up that way is you're kind of limited in how much you can teach in the back end in Node without what we call a persistent data store, right? We can save data in our JavaScript, but as soon as the server reboots, we lose all of that data. And so the way we save data is into a database, and that's what lets it be persistent, right? That's what, when you reboot your computer, bring it back online, your database is still going to be there. But if you reboot your Node server, your JavaScript server, that data just disappears every time it reboots. And that's something that we're going to see in the next couple days, and why we're kind of splitting it up that way. So quick side note, database servers are often considered the back end. So the back end kind of gets lumped with what we call your application server, again, Node.js and running the Express framework, and then your database server. Those get kind of grouped together, but when you're looking at a stack is your front end, no matter if it's a mobile application or a web application or even a terminal interface. It's your backend application server, again, Node and Express, and then it's your database, whether that's SQL or what's called NoSQL, like Mongo, or something like that. So anyway, Gus is going to go a lot more in depth, but wanted to kind of give you an idea of why we're splitting it up the way we are, of giving you an idea of what the backend is, kind of working with applications there, not worrying too much about saving the data. Then we go into structuring data properly in the database with Gus, and how to do that. You're going to learn the raw SQL of, okay, if I'm just working with a database, how can I write a command to get data into my database? How can I write a command to get data out of my database? CRUD is going to be your friend, both in this module and the database module, and when I come back to finish up Node, right? You got to think about your create, read, update, and delete. SQL does not use those specific words, but those concepts are the same always, again and again, right? Whenever you have data, there's got to be some way to read the data. There's got to be some way to create data so there's something to be read. There's got to be a way to get rid of that data and delete it. And there's got to be a way of updating or editing that data. And so those concepts you'll see in the database. And then when you come back from Gus, we're going to circle all the way back, bring it full circle to the shopping app that you guys were working with Joey. And we are going to layer in all kinds of backend goodness with not only Node and Express, but now all of the knowledge that you have of Postgres. So this is definitely building on each other. If you're feeling overwhelmed now, take a breather, raise your hand, schedule a one-on-one for any concepts that you are still struggling with. Part of that will just be time, experience practicing with JavaScript, right? There are certain things that it just takes time to type. You see me typing JavaScript and you're like, how can he possibly be typing that fast? That just takes years of experience and practice of doing that. But if you're struggling with concepts, it is more important to understand the why when you read code, as opposed to the being able to write it on your own, right? You want to be able to pick up any piece of code and understand really what you're reading, and why it's doing that. So we are going to try and break things down into the smallest steps possible. I probably won't adhere to it this tonight, but the teaching technique I would like to do is explaining what I'm going to teach you, write out the code, and just don't even try and follow along. Just see the code as I'm typing it, make sure you're understanding it. We are then going to take a break and give everyone a chance to write the code on their own. And then we are going to come back together, and I'm going to start calling on people if they don't volunteer to summarize what we just did, kind of talk through the code and how they understand it. The reason why we are taking that pace is because if you thought there were a lot of files in React, just wait until we get into the backend, because your backend code is separate from your front end code. And once we layer in the database, that is going to be a whole nother level of code. And so I'm hoping to take lots of breaks and give everyone a chance to to catch up. If you would like to code along with me, I'm not going to stop you. But I am hoping to give everyone enough time to kind of take a breather, get caught up, and then move on with those concepts. So with all of that said, I'd like to open the floor up to any questions dating all the way back, since the beginning of the program. Does anyone have questions about React? Does anyone have questions about what the stack is, or what we're getting ourselves into, or any questions from the presentation earlier tonight? Anyone need an excuse to run out the door and start sobbing? Anything at all?
I have a question.
Shoot.
It might be kind of a convoluted question, but when we worked on the project with Joey, he used I think it was the poster put in place of delete. And I remember when he said it, like I said to myself, why are we not using delete? But then he explained why. I'm just wondering if that's like a standard that's done rather than get rid of that content. You instead update it, even if that update means that stuff is removed from the database. Does that make sense?
Did he use like a deleted @ flag, or he set deleted to true or something like that?
No, I think he, someone else may remember it. He literally, I think it was post, but I could be wrong. but I don't remember him including the delete in it at all. It was basically like update this. The endpoint, one of the endpoints was removed, if I'm not mistaken, and he wrote that into the API, like when you use such and such.
I would have to look at what API he was using. So kind of the exciting part of teaching this module is you now get to look behind the curtain. And so all of the stuff that you did with Ryan, right, with like the students and the teachers and posting and all of that stuff, you are going to be able to see and create your own APIs with that. And so I would have to look at not only Joey's code of what he was doing on the front end, but also kind of look at the back end that he was using to understand how the back end was written and what the back end was expecting. So the one of the key concepts of this module is getting your front end code to match your back end code, because they are two completely separate pieces of code. Yes, they are technically both running JavaScript, but it is other than JavaScript, there are not very many languages that let you write a front end website and a back end server using the same language. Historically, before Node came out, it was very traditional to write your back end code in a different programming language. PHP, Python, Ruby, Java, .NET, with C#, I believe. Those are all popular back-end programming languages. And so I'd say about 10-ish years ago, someone had this crazy idea of, well, if we can write JavaScript in our front end, why can't we write JavaScript for our back end and run it as a server? Because JavaScript does one thing really well, and it's that it handles events, right? It handles this notion of on submit or on click, or you click on a link or whatever it is. JavaScript handles that really well. And someone kind of put 2 and 2 together and said, well, an API call is kind of like an event, right? We're saying, hey, go store this student information or go store whatever, and then send me back some data. And so someone had the crazy idea of, well, we could use JavaScript in the server, and hey, JavaScript is actually really fast because it's built around events so well. And so that's when Node.js got born. So Node.js is a relatively up and newcomer in the backend space. With that said, there are huge companies like Google and Microsoft and NASDAQ and all kinds of huge companies have gone all in on Node and said, hey, we believe in this. So to reiterate, when you are applying for jobs and they say, oh, we use Ruby on Rails, or we use PHP and Laravel, or we use .NET and C#, which is, I know I'm going to get spited for companies that still use this, but it's an older framework. It is very Microsoft heavy. It is still the dominant job opportunity in Syracuse. And so when you see all of those, don't just go, oh, well, we learned JavaScript, I can't apply to that job. Because all of these concepts that we're learning, it doesn't matter what syntax, what language you're doing, the concepts stay the same across all of them, right? All backend web servers have a notion of connecting to a database. The syntax that they use may be a little different, but at the end of the day, when you look at the concepts that you're learning here, it is very easy to take those concepts and apply it to the other programming languages. So the reason why we're teaching Node is because we do think, and the bulk of the instructors think, that JavaScript is the future. But it is important to balance that out with, there are lots of other backend programming languages out there, and the concepts that you are going to be learning in the next 5 weeks can be applied to pretty much any backend programming language or framework or whatever. So I completely sidestepped your question, but in the next 2 or 3 days, you're going to see a delete endpoint. And I will show you, if you remind me when we do the delete, of how we can kind of sidestep that and make anything happen, on any kind of request. And some frameworks don't like the delete word. It's just a non-standard thing for them. And so I'll show you how we can kind of hijack the post request to get delete working with a post as opposed to a delete. Other questions? Anyone? Okay, I'm gonna kick off my calling on people unless someone wants to volunteer. What are we going to be learning this week? Server-side code. You got it. We're going to practice sending data to and from our backend. And that is that pretty much in summary. Yep, Node.js. Perfect. Important that you guys can cut through all of my meandering lecturing to, really boil it down. I think that's the important thing, right? Okay. So can anyone guess where we are going to start with learning server-side code? In the terminal, Susan, that is a great answer. Yes, we are going to start in the terminal. In order to work on a backend server, we need to get our backend server up and running. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try and stay in VS Code as much as possible. Okay. So I am going to open up my code folder, and I'm going to create a new folder called module 7. And I'm going to create another folder in there called week 1. And then in that folder, I am going to create something called add server. And I'm avoiding any spaces in my file names. I'm avoiding any dashes, anything, any slashes, anything like that. And that's because when we create our npm init, which we're about to do in 1 second, npm is going to get cranky with us if we're using anything that could cause problems. So I'm camel casing here. I'm going to call that add server, and I'm going to pop that open. And once we get that open, I am going to right click over here, and I'm going to say open an integrated terminal. And I don't know what all that stuff is. Hopefully, yep, it's not going to cause problems. Okay. So now that we are in our terminal, we are going to get very terminal heavy from here on out, because we are not only going to need to use our terminal to run our Node server, we're also going to use our terminal to run our React server. So Code Sandbox was kind of doing that for us behind the scenes, right? But we're going to be using Create React app to get our server up and running and really understand what's happening there. So you can see I've got my terminal set up to show me my path. Never hurts to run pwd and make sure you understand where you're at. You're in your careers in code, in my code, in module 7, in week 1, in add server. And again, I just right clicked over here and I opened up my integrated terminal, and that popped it open. So yeah, you feel free, if you would like to follow along with me, you can. But I will take a break and give everyone a chance to catch up to where I'm at. So now that we are here, I am going to run npm init -y. Let me blow that up one more step for you guys. So hopefully that's a little easier. npm init is going to do what for us? Yep, initiate and allow packages. Yeah, so what it's really going to do is create package.json for us. and package.json is what allows us to keep track of what npm packages we have installed. React uses npm a lot. You guys probably had a little experience installing packages with npm with React. That is the same npm that powers all of that React code is the same npm that powers a lot of Node.js and server-side code as well. So I'm going to run my npm init-y, and that created package.json for me. We see it over here. I can pop it open and see what's in there. If you do get an error message on that, it will probably be because your name has a space in it or something that npm doesn't like. If you run npm init without the -y, you're able to specify all of this information in here and give it a name that it will be comfortable with. Okay, we've got our npm initted. Our packages aren't even in here because we haven't installed any packages. Can anyone guess what the first package we are going to install is? So we don't have to install Node because we've already installed that locally on our computer. So actually, I'm going to take that question back for 1 second, and you'll. No, I'm going to steamroll forward. Take it back. We are going to install Express. So we are going to npm I space, and then we want to type in -s, and that -s is telling npm, hey, when I run it, add that to my package.json file. So the reason why that's important is if you send your code to anyone, all you want to do is send your code. You don't want to send all of the packages related with your code. And so what the package.json file does is when you send your code, the person can run npm install or npm I, and that's going to install all the dependencies without having to send them with your code. So I'm going to npm install, and I am going to say Express and hit enter there. It's going to take a second, and you notice in my dependencies, I now have Express in there. Again, Express is a package that allows us to write our code in a less verbose way. So just like React is a framework or a library that we installed with npm, Express is a kind of similar, but it's for the back end instead of the front end code. Okay, well, now I've got it installed, but I need a place to put my code. So I'm going to right click and say new file, and I'm just going to call it app.js. Naming convention wise, you can call it app, you could call it index, you could call it server, you could call it start. I've seen a lot of different things that people call kind of what they call the entry file or the root file, but we're just going to say app.js. All right, we've got some JavaScript code. We've got some code, a place to put our code now. So I'm just going to console log test. Now, we're writing what kind of code now? JavaScript, but where are we going to run our JavaScript? The back end. Yes, Latonia. So if we're using it on the back end, what command do we use in the terminal? You guys have already used it. Kyle, you got it. Node. Brandy, we're not going to use start quite yet, but I can show you guys later on how we can make our start command kick off our node code. So I'm going to come down into my terminal. I'm going to type in node, and I'm going to type in app.js, and we got our test logging out. Okay, progress already. Now I would like to pull in Express. So what are the two different ways we can pull in code from npm? Import is one, and does anyone remember the other? Require, you got it, Latonia. So require is what we call common JS. It is the older way of doing things. And then the import export commands are what we call ES6 modules. ES6 is just the version of JavaScript, and then modules is this notion of import export. React is kind of on the forefront of supporting import export and does a lot of things under the hood with something called Webpack in order to make import export work for you. Node isn't quite as caught up. If you have the very latest version of Node, you can use import export out of the gate, but Node is catching up on that and is still using require. So you will find a lot of code examples online, especially for backend code, that is still using require. So we're going to go through using require just so you get practice with both. Encourage you to use import export still in React because React supports that out of the gate. Eventually, in the next year or two, Node will support import export right out of the gate and has made it clear that they prefer import export because it's native to JavaScript itself. But because we're still getting updated and getting onto those versions, we're going to use require to start. So I am going to do a const express, and I am going to require express. And all I'm doing there, pulling in express from NPM, getting some goodness from there. Now, express, you could actually have multiple express apps running at the same time. We are only going to have one. So we are going to say const app is equal to express with the parentheses. And what that is doing is it's saying, hey, call in my express code and run the express code to give me an app that I can work with. Okay, so now we've got our app started. We need to tell our app, hey, listen for some calls coming in, some endpoints that are being requested. So we are going to say app.listen, and it's going to say, where do you want me to listen? So you remember when you wrote like HTTP localhost :3000? That is what we're doing. We're specifying the port that the server is going to be running on. So I'm going to pick 3000 only because it's not commonly used on the computer. Only one server can be running per port. And so we picked 3000 because it's kind of out of the way. It's not many other applications would be running on 3000. And then we want some information. We want to actually add a callback in here. So I'm going to add my function that says console.log server is running on port 3000. And the reason I add that is because I'm going to add some more code up here eventually. If any of that code is broken in my terminal, it's not going to show me that my server is running. It's going to throw some error instead. But if we make it all the way down to the server is running on port 3000, that means all of our backend code ran fine and the server is started up and waiting for requests. So I'm going to come down to my terminal. I'm going to make sure I save my file, which I promise you I will do 5,000 times, forget to save. I'm going to do my node app.js. I'm going to run it, and I get my servers running on 3000. Okay, so what? We haven't accomplished anything, right? We've got our server running, but we haven't done anything practical with it yet. So in order to stop my server from running, I'm going to hit Control-C, and that's going to bring me back out to my terminal. We need to add one more piece of code, and then we are going to stop, and I'm going to let everyone catch up. We need to tell our server, hey, make an endpoint. Have something that we can hit in our browser, that we can get some information back from. So we are going to say app, and then we are going to use get. Right? Get is probably the easiest of the HTTP methods. It's the one that we can run in the browser that we don't need Postman for. We're just going to go for that. And so we are going to put our quotes in, and it's saying, what is the root? What is the name of the endpoint? How are we going to get to this in the browser? So I'm going to make my root /hello. And then there's a concept that I'm going to go into after you guys get this code running, just to not overwhelm you. But I'm going to add a function in here that takes two parameters, rec and res. Don't worry, I'll explain to you what the rec and res is down the road. I'm going to say res.send. And I think it's against the programming gods if we don't do a hello world. Okay, I'm going to save that. I'm going to pop down to my terminal. I'm going to start up my node app.js. All right, I've got my server running on port 3000. Woo! But where's my hello world? Well, we've got to connect to the server. We've got to use our endpoint. So I'm going to pop open my web browser. I'm going to go to localhost 3000, and I am going to go to /hello. And when I do that, I get my hello world. Okay, going to take a break there. I'm going to leave this code up. I am going to share it in the pasted code channel. And I'm going to take a break and let anyone ask questions. Sure can. And it's also in Slack if it's easier for you to read that code over there. You can see the commands that I ran down here. The only one up at the top is going to be your npm init. And just make sure you're in your right folder, your correct folder, I should say, by right-clicking over here and opening in the integrated terminal to make, to make sure that you're at the right path. But I ran my npm init -y, and then here are the other commands that I ran. And again, your end objective is to get hello world showing up in your browser.
Max, I have a question.
Shoot.
I'm getting cannot get, and then it's showing a slash, and I went through and tried to double check that I was on the right, everything.
Go ahead and share your screen.
Hold on. You see?
Okay, so the problem here is that we specifically added our root to /hello. And so all you need to do is add your /hello in your browser right there.
Oh, I forgot to go to the actual endpoint. Is that what I did?
Yep,
okay.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Max, can you put your screen back?
Sure can.
And the app.js file, we're supposed to create that, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So to create that, I just right-clicked over here and said new file.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I just didn't.
I'm going to launch a poll. If you were able to get it working, go ahead and say that you were. If you're still working on it, don't answer anything. Or if you want to just steamroll forward, go ahead and say that. Latonia, we probably need to go over as a class at some point, setting up our git ignore files to not add everything that's in node modules. That isn't a task that I have the energy to surmount tonight because it's going to cause problems for people. But it's not the end of the world if you do commit all 330 of those files. The problem is that when we npm installed Express, even though we only installed one little package, Express has all of these different dependencies that Express requires to run. And some of these dependencies have their own dependencies as well. So your 330 files are likely coming from everything inside your node modules. You should never edit code in node modules yourself. The reasoning behind that is if any one of your packages gets upgraded, it's going to overwrite your code and break a lot of different things. So node modules is never really something that you should be editing. Sometimes it is helpful to dig in there to help debug and understand how the code is working under the hood, but that is a more advanced technique. Node modules is basically the place that when we install something from npm, node modules is the folder that houses all of that code. We can tell our Git, hey, we don't really need to commit all of these files into our repository, because if we need them again, we can just npm install and it would go to our package.json and pull the list from there and know exactly what to install. So we will tackle at some point git ignore and making it so Git knows that it can ignore everything in node modules and not have to commit it, but not the end of the world tonight if you do commit that big chunk of files.
Thank you. I think somebody addressed this with Kyle. Kyle had a question about it when she did something, I think for her capstone. And I feel like someone gave her like a solid explanation. I just don't remember like where it was so that I can reference it. So it'll be great to do it as a class. Thanks.
It's one of those things that as developers, it's a hard lesson to learn, but when you've learned it, you're glad you know it, because node modules and dependencies are a problem no matter what programming language you're using. And managing your repository and basically saying, hey, these are the files you should care about and these are the ones that you shouldn't. And so we will cover that probably sometime this week. Got 8 responses on the poll. I'd like to get up to 10 before we move on. So if anyone has questions, feel free to shout them out.
Hey Max, this is Sean. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So here, did we create a server or did we call something through Express?
We created a server. Yeah. So when we run node app.js in our terminal, that is starting up our server for us. And so now the server kind of needs to know a couple things. It's like, all right, node app.js, what kind of server do you want? And so we pull in Express here, right? And once we pull in Express, that gives us access to the framework, but we haven't created the Express app or the Express server yet. And so what this second line of code does is it says, the first line pulls in Express from NPM. The second line tells Node, hey, we actually want an Express app or an Express server. And so that's what the app.js or the app online 2 does here. Then we come in and we say, all right, we would like an endpoint. What kind of endpoint do you want? We want to use a get endpoint. And that get endpoint is coming from our app. Where's our app coming from? It's coming from Express. Where's Express coming from? It's coming from NPM. Okay, now that we've got our app, we use a callback function in here, and we say we want to send some data back. I haven't forgotten about recres. I am going to come back to that in 1 second. Okay, we are sending back hello world. All right, great. The server knows what to do now. When we send hello, we've got to tell the server to do one more thing. We've got to tell our server to listen. And it is going to listen on the port for 3000. What is it listening for? Anyone trying to access the hello endpoint. And then we use a callback in here just to say, hey, let's make sure the server's all started up so that when we're in our terminal, we see that it is running on port 3000. And so what we just did is we created a Express server that has one get endpoint called /hello that is sending the text back of hello world. And that Express server is listening or running on port 3000. And then we are using Node in our terminal to execute that Express app code or the Express server code. Okay, we've got 10 people in the poll. So I am going to steamroll forward. Okay. So we've got a little problem here. When we change some code in React and hit save, you know how it like auto updated in Code Sandbox for us, and we were like, wow, this is awesome. We don't need to refresh. Well, I would love for Node to do that as well. If I come over here and I say, hello world, I changed this, and save and pop over to my browser and refresh, I get hello world. When I refresh again, I still have hello world. Well, I can fix this by going back into my VS Code and hit Control-C, and then I'm going to hit Up, Enter, and that's going to start my server over for me. And now if I come back to the browser and refresh, I get my I changed this. Well, that's a pain. The computer should be smart enough to know that when I change my code, just reboot the server for me. So there is a great package that we can use called Nodemon to do this. Well, it's a package, so we need to install it. So we are going to npm I, and we want to save this, and we are going to install Nodemon, Nodemon. And that's going to take a quick second, and that's going to install for me. And we know it's installed because if I go to my package.json, I can see I've got Nodemon as a dependency now. So I'm going to come back to my code, and instead of running node app.js, I'm going to now run Nodemon app.js. And when I start that up, you notice it's a little different. Nodemon's giving me the version number, and it's telling me what it's watching, and it's telling me it's running my node app.js. And there's my server running on port 3000. Awesome. I'm going to come back over here. I refresh. My code's still here. And if I take something out and save, you notice in my terminal, it says restarting due to changes, starting node app.js server running on 3000. Well, I didn't have to do anything in the server or in the terminal, but when I come over here and refresh, I see my I changed. So we are using Nodemon over here to automatically restart the server whenever we make changes. Any questions about that? Now, one thing that you are guaranteed to be running into as throughout your course as a full stack developer, you're going to have a couple terminal windows open. We are going to have servers running for the front end, for the back end, sometimes multiple back ends at the same time. So what you may run into is if we hit Control-C and stop our server and then come over and hit refresh, you're going to get this site can't be reached, or you're going to get a 404 error, right? So whenever you run into something like this, first step you want to check, pop over to your terminal and make sure your server is running with Nodemon app.js or node app.js. And when we come over here and we refresh, we get our code back. I'm going to take a break and let either Kyle or Shaw or Sarah share their terminal. Interesting. Can you close your terminal and reopen it? And then run Nodemon app.js. Okay, try this. Try npx space Nodemon app.js. Okay, So that's the command everyone should use. npx is a special command that basically will either install Nodemon in a temporary folder so you can run it if you don't have it, or if you have it somewhere on your computer, it will use that local copy to run it. At some point, I probably configured my computer to be able to use Nodemon across all projects, and that's why it's probably working without npx on mine. So if I remember, I will circle back to setting up Nodemon so you can use it in any project. And there are other ways other than Nodemon to get your server to automatically reboot. Nodemon is probably the more old school way of doing it, but it's a method that's used by a lot of people. So there's nothing wrong in running npx space Nodemon space app.js. The app.js may even be optional. You may be able to just run npx Nodemon, and it will do the right thing for you. But we will run with that until I go through how to install it globally to not be a problem. Nodemon isn't quite like React Router, because React Router is doing all of the routes and all of the paths and opening the right files and all of that stuff. That's all handled by Express. Express has a router built into it. If you were trying to draw a parallel to React, React would use something like Webpack in order to detect file changes and then rebuild your React code so it can run in the browser. So React uses something similar. Nodemon is what we call a file watcher, and exactly as it sounds. It's literally watching files to see if something has changed, and if it has, it reboots the server for us. Yes, if your server is running, you need to Control-C out of the current server to restart the server using Nodemon, which will have the file watcher and the auto restart built into it. Dominique, the app crashing is probably due to something in your code. Do you want to share your screen quickly? You see it in the browser by going to localhost:3000/hello. Okay, so Dominique, we've got an issue. I'm glad you're bringing this up. It says e-addr in use. That is a very common error that you will see. You have another server already running on port 3000. And my guess is that it's going to be in one of the two terminals you have running over here. And it's probably going to be in that one that says node. So if we pop that one open, yep, we've got, I think, our server running there. Yeah, we do, because we don't have a new command line to type anything in. So you got it. You Control-C there. Now go ahead and hop back to where you were, probably the bottom one, although it doesn't really matter. Now you can try your npx space Nodemon and space app.js. And again, I think that file name's optional. I just don't remember off the top of my head, and you're good to go. So as frequently as you will run into your server not running, you will also run into trying to run your server too many times, right? Only one thing, even if it's the exact same server, can run on that port. So we want to Control-C out of everything, make sure that that server isn't running anywhere else, and then we'll be able to restart it. So very common issue. Thank you for sharing that, Dominique. Okay, other questions?
This is Latonia. I had two quick questions.
Sure.
I feel like I remember us being told about npx. Is that the one where it auto uninstalls itself after you run it? Like you're basically borrowing. Okay, so I would know correctly. My other thing is, what's the result we're looking for now?
We're looking to see hello world in the browser. I'm not sharing my screen. Don't even bother telling me. Okay, we're looking to see hello world in the browser, and making sure that if we're over here and we've got our code running with Nodemon, that we can change it and hit save, and then just pop over in the browser, not touching our terminal, refreshing the page and getting that to show up. So you do have to refresh the page in the browser to see the changes, but you do not have to restart the server in order to see the changes.
Thank you.
And Carolyn, you probably can't get in your browser because you forgot the /hello. So we made our endpoint be on /hello.
Yeah, I typed in the code initially for the practice, but then I just copied what you had in Slack, and you probably did something since that.
No, the code in Slack should be able to get you to hello world in the browser. Just make
Okay.
sure that when you are typing in your URL in the browser, you have /hello at the end of it.
Oh, yeah, yeah, thank you. Sorry.
And so to that point, if we just wanted it to work without anything at the end, we can just delete what's in front of that /, hit save. Now when we refresh, it's going to say cannot get hello because we removed that endpoint. But if we take that out there and run, we get our hello world back. So it is possible to have something at what we call the root. The root meaning there's nothing after it. It's just the /. And so whenever I create an API, I always put some kind of hello world, you've reached the API, just so I know the API is running and there aren't any problems.
Max,
Okay.
Max, can I just share real quick just to
Yep.
double check that I'm doing this right? Okay. I did check to see that I have the Node.js. I mean the Node, right? So that's all set.
Yep.
May
So
change.
you want to get Node running in your terminal with npx, hit Control-C to stop it. And then we're going to switch over to using Nodemon. So we're going to do npx space Nodemon. And just hit enter there. I think by default that should work. Okay, that kind of worked. If you scroll up a little bit there.
Where?
In the terminal.
Okay.
Okay, keep going down.
This way?
No, I lied. We can't. Hit Control-C in the terminal.
Okay.
And go ahead and do npx space Nodemon space app.js. It got very cranky that we did not specify a file name. Do app.js there.
Like that.
Yep. I was wrong. That is required. Okay. So now you've got it running. Now you can come over and refresh. And you got it. But
Okay.
now when you change some of your code and save that file, and now when you hop over to your browser and refresh, you'll notice you didn't have to restart your server for that to update.
Thank you.
No problem. So it's very common. It's rare for me to start a Node server these days without Nodemon because chances are I'm going to be working on the code and I want it to automatically restart for me. So Nodemon, probably the most popular way to auto restart your server once you change your code. Okay, we are going to talk a little bit about rec-res. We're going to get two numbers adding together, and then we are going to take a break. Sound good to everyone? Cool. Before we do that, someone talk me through what this code is doing. And not in chat, actually come off mute and talk me through what's happening.
I'll go.
Go for it.
I think that we are sending, we're sending out our code to the browser or to a browser.
We are. Go line by line for me.
Oh, well, first we're calling this package express, right? So we can use it.
Yep.
And then the second line in our app file or our whole app, I guess we're using it with the parentheses to have it running. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, we're basically telling it, hey, I would like an Express app or an Express server because we could theoretically be running multiple servers at the same time.
Okay. So if you did that, you would have other things written here. You would.
Yeah, we can actually set that up pretty quickly. Now, what was the rule that I said about ports? You can only have it on one port at a time, right? So if I put this on 3000 and say, and I save that, I get a big error because I forgot parentheses at the end. We got error, the app crashed, emitted error, order an add in use, right? So our address it's yelling at us because we're trying to start two apps at the same time. So if I just change this to port 3001 and probably change our console log so it's telling the truth, we now see our two servers running, and I can come over to my browser and refresh on 3000 and get my hello world and change it to 3001 and get my server 2 running as well. So that's just a quick example of we can have two Express servers or Express apps running at the same time. We just can't have them running on the same port at the same time. Okay, sorry, I interrupted there.
No, that's okay. Do you want me to keep going or you want someone else to do the rest?
No, keep going. Only got a couple more lines to go.
Okay, the app.get is, I forget, we're reading it or we're sending it?
We're basically saying when a GET request comes in, be prepared for that.
Okay. And then I'm guessing the res.send is what is the wording that's sending out our written code or whatever that our greeting.
Yep.
Yep. And then the bottom line app.listen, I think that's telling the app where we are, what our port is.
Exactly. And just telling it, hey, be prepared to listen to requests coming in. So gonna ride that wave. You hear me saying request and you hear me saying response. Hey, that kind of lines up with rec and res. Rec and res are common abbreviations for request and response. Okay, well, doesn't matter what we call it. Rec res is just a shortcut, right? We can, because they're parameters, the only thing that matters is the order of them. Express is automatically passing in our request. Our request is the browser literally requesting information from the server, right? Our response is what the server is responding to the request from to send back to the browser. So we can come in here and look at our request. So I'm going to add a console log in there. Nothing shows up. But as soon as I come over here and request something and use the right port, we see hello world. That's nothing special. But if we come over here, holy moly, that's a lot of data in our request. It's got information about the connection. It's got information about the content length and whether it's finished. It's got access to the path name that was requested. It's got all kinds of stuff. TCP coming in here of how that request came in. Information about the timeout, how long the server is going to allow that request to happen before it goes back to the browser and goes, nah, I didn't do it in time. All kinds of crazy stuff in here. Here we've got information about a cookie coming in, even what browser and computer I'm using. It knows that I'm making that request using Chrome on my Intel Mac, and what even version of the operating system I'm using, which is very interesting because I'm on Mac OS 11. So kind of interesting that that hasn't been updated yet. It knows that I'm using Google Chrome. It's got all kinds of really cool information in the request. The host, all of that. We are going to use a very specific part of that to pull some information in from the request. And then we are going to send that back using our response. So the oversimplification of this is the request, it's all the information coming into our server, and the response is everything we are sending back to the server. So what we are going to do is we are going to create our app.get, and we are going to create a new endpoint called add. And add is going to take two pieces of information, and the way it's going to take that is what we call a root parameter. A root parameter is something that we're sending in the root, in the endpoint itself, right? In the address of the endpoint. And so I'm going to add a colon there, and I'm going to say num1, and then I'm going to add another colon and say num2. And what that colon is doing is it's basically naming my variable. So whatever comes between these slashes, I'm going to be able to access from the request as a root parameter because it's part of the endpoint root, the URL. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to do my recres as always and my arrow function. And by the way, because this is just like JavaScript, it is JavaScript. If I wanted to write it old school and not use an arrow function, I could. Doesn't really matter. Arrow functions are definitely the more modern way of creating a function. But if you want to go old school, that's completely fine. And so I just want to console.log, and I'm going to, because it's information coming in, it's going to be in the request. And I'm going to console.log my rec.params. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to scroll down here so I can see my server rebooted automatically for me because I'm up running Nodemon. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to say /add, and then I'm going to say /1/2. And I'm going to hit enter. And I've got a spinny. Just spinning and not doing anything. I come over to my server. Well, I have my object here. This is cool. My object has num1 and num2 in it. And that's just like an object. So I could say .num1 and save that. And if I come over to my browser, I see my ones logging out. That's cool. But I still have a spinny, right? It's still trying to load. Well, what's happening here is Chrome has sent a request to my server, and I never told my server what the response should be. And so my server is like, all right, I'm done. I did everything that I needed it to. And the browser's sitting over here like, yo, I sent you a request. I'd like some information back. So eventually the browser is going to give up after a minute or 2 minutes. I forget what the default is, and say, this request timed out. Sorry, can't load it. So in order to fix that, all we need to do is come down here and add in a res.send. And we don't even have to send anything, any text back, any content back. We just need to send the response back. We just need to say, hey, I got your request. Here's a response. So now when I come over here and refresh, and remember to save my code, now we just get a white screen. But you notice it's not spinning anymore. That's because the response came back. So we've got our response.send. We've got access to our numbers via the params. Now we want to add them together. So that should be easy, right? I'm going to come in my res.send, and I'm going to say rec.params.num1 plus rec.params.num2. I should get a lovely 3, right? I'm adding 1 to 2, 1, 2, 3, 12. That's not what I wanted. Let's go back. When I scroll up here, notice what's coming in my object is the string 1 and the string 2. Well, what happens when we add two strings together? We concatenate them and shove them right next to each other. So by default, Express doesn't know that whatever is coming in here is a number, because most of the times it won't be a number. It will be some string or something like that. So all we are going to do is throw a quick parse int on these. And that is going to convert my string into an actual number. I'm going to save. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to refresh. Invalid status code 3. Boo. I have to make this a string because React does not, Express does not like me sending back just a number. They want me to send back a string. So what we did is we used a template literal here to parse out the number coming in from our parameters. So this whole thing is now equal to 1. This whole thing is now equal to 2, both as actual numbers. We add them together, and then we use this template literal here to convert it back into a string. So if I save that and I refresh, now I have my 3. So I'm going to shove this all the way over there. I don't think I can make that small enough. So I'm going to leave this open. How are we feeling? Do we want to take a break, or we want to do 10 more minutes? Thumbs up if you want to keep going. Open mouth if you want to take a break. Okay, we will break here only because there are only a couple more concepts that I want to cover tonight. So head back here at 7:30, and I will stay on and leave the screen up in case anyone has questions. I will also paste it in Slack before anyone can ask for it. Dominique, I swear I didn't see your message before I did that. I'm going to go into a breakout room for a second. I will.
Excuse me, Matt?
Shoot.
I'm sorry, I didn't know if you were still in, well, obviously you're here, so not the breakout, but what did we put in the browser? You said /1, 2, I forget what you.
Yep. /add/1/2. And the reason we're doing that is because it lines up with our app.get. We called it /add/num1 with a colon in front, which is what's telling Express, hey, that's going to go into the params.
Okay.
And then num2 is also going to go into the params.
Okay.
So we just match that the entire :num1 is what we put in the URL.
Thank you. That'll help me reading it instead of asking going forward. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Max. I think you just answered my question, but I was coding. For the URL, we want to do /num1 or /num2.
So in your code itself, you want to do /:num1/:num2.
There's a space before the colon, right?
No space.
Oh, it looked like there was. Okay.
And that's basically telling React, hey, be prepared to have a number come in here and dump that into our rec.params so we can access it. So that's what the point of the colon is doing. But over in the browser, we're going to do just /1/2. And the slashes in between it are what is dropping num1 into our rec.params.num1.
So you're just pulling the 1 and 2 and the slashes out of the code basically, and it knows what to do. Okay, great.
Correct.
Thank you.
No
Same
problem.
server though, right?
Same,
All right.
all same server, yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, Karen, I don't know how to get myself in a separate room. Like I can assign everyone else, it just doesn't let me assign myself.
I think because when like when you're co-host, when I did it, it was weird. Like I had to assign them and then there was a way to join or something, but I know that I can't assign you because you're the host.
Yeah, and I opened the room and I still didn't see a way to get in. Let me just send you a Google Meet link.
All right.
let everyone trickle back in here and we will get back to it. Can you guys hear the air conditioner running at all behind me? Okay, good. I was a audio technician in high school and college, and so clean audio is like top priority for me. All right, I think we have most everyone back. All right, so first of all, do we have any questions? Anything pop up over the break where you're like, what are we doing? All right, so we talked a little bit about our root parameters, right? When we add our parameters into the endpoint root itself, we're able to pull it out. Does anyone remember maybe from Ryan's module what another way to send data to your backend is? Post, kind of on the right track. .then is handling it when the data comes back. It is, we are using a get right now. What we're looking for, I think, Dominique, you're on the right track, is a get parameter. So do you remember when you put a question mark in your URL and then you could add in some data after it? That is what we call a get parameter. So this is one of 3 ways we're going to cover to send data to the backend. It's actually a 4th, which is data in your headers, but we're not going to go too far into that. So we just covered our root parameter. We are now going to cover our get parameter. And so what we are going to do is say app.get, and we are going to call this /add2, right? Just as another example, so we can keep this running. Now I'm going to create my function. I'm going to do it with an arrow function just because I'm the cool hip developer. I am going to do my res.send. And whenever I create a new function, I try and get in the habit of res.sending. Even if it's blank, even if I haven't figured out what I'm sending back yet, I like to do my res.send so I don't forget it, right? Because otherwise, if someone hits that endpoint, the browser's just going to wait and wait and wait. And the server is going to be like, I don't know what you're expecting me to do. You didn't tell me to send anything back. So kind of like when you type in your opening curly brace, you type in your closing curly brace. I try to follow that rule. Whenever you create an endpoint, just throw your res.send in, even if there's nothing in there. Okay, so what I am going to do is I am going to console.log, instead of my rec.params, I am going to console log out my rec.query. And that is our query params. Well, query params come in our URL. So instead of add, I'm going to do /add2. I deleted out my numbers and I'm going to do a question mark. And the question mark is now telling the server, hey, additional data that comes after this question mark, those are my query parameters. Now, query parameters are kind of cool because they're not just the value of the query parameter. The query parameter also has a key to go with it. So I'm going to say num1, and num1 is going to equal 5. And then in order to separate out our query parameters, kind of like a question mark is the special starter, I'm going to use an ampersand, shift 7, and then I'm going to say num2 is equal to 3. I'm going to hit enter there, and I get a blank page back. Well, that's better than nothing, right? Because I res.send something. So the browser's not waiting. It's not going to hang up. It's not going to time out. It's not going to do any of that stuff. Let me try and blow that up. No, I can't blow that up. Okay. I will send that in the Slack chat because I cannot blow it up. Okay, so that's what I've got typed in. Now, if I scroll down in my console, you see I've got this object here. And that object looks very familiar. In fact, if we scroll up to where we console logged out our rec.params, it comes in the same way. It's just an object, and we have access to that object like we would any other object. So I'm going to actually take this exact same code from our first add method where we were coming in with the root parameters. I'm going to throw that down in my add to, but instead of looking at the params that are coming in from the root, I am going to look at my query instead. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to come back over to my browser, and I'm going to refresh, and boom, we've got 8. Now, the important thing here is, remember how I said it's all about matching, making sure what's in your browser, your front-end code is matching the back-end code? Well, look what's happening here. If I change my num1 to just say first num, and my num2 to say second num, and I hit enter, not a number. Well, what's going on? My server is looking specifically for num1 in my URL. And so we need to update that and say first num and second num. If I save that and refresh, there I get my addition back. And just to prove this is working, I can change one of the numbers and get the addition. So I'm going to take a quick break there and let you guys catch up on this, only because where we're headed next is into Postman. And this is probably a good breaking point. Susan, Nodemon crashing is usually due to a syntax error. If you hit Control-C to stop your server and then start it up again, if it crashes again, it's probably due to something wrong in your code. I would say kind of push yourself a little bit to see if you can figure out what the error message is telling you. And if you can't, let me know and you can share your screen.
Okay, and then just to restart Nodemon, I just do Nodemon after I Control-C, I do Nodemon app.js.
You want to do npx space Nodemon space app.js.
Okay.
And we're using npx as kind of a crutch right now because I didn't do my homework on getting that installed globally for you guys.
So we're always going to use that until you
get it installed globally.
Whatever.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. All right, I'll try that. Thank you.
And that's not going to cause any damage to your computer, or it's not the end of the world that you don't have it installed locally. And I'm going to launch the poll again, hopefully. Hopefully it will let me reuse it. Okay. If you're still working on it, don't answer the poll. If you have it working, go ahead and vote. And if you want to just power through, that is an option on the poll as well. That will do it, Susan. Every character matters. All right, we've got 7 votes in on the poll. Once we get over the 10 threshold, I will keep going. We're steamrolling to the finish line at 8 o'clock, so I will be around for questions. Shaw, feel free to kind of noodle on your error a little bit, and if you don't understand it, let me know and you can share your screen. So we want to think of errors not as, oh man, my code isn't working. We want to think of errors as the first step on our debugging process, right? So everyone has a different number, but some people say writing code is 50% debugging. Some people say debugging code is 90% of all of programming. Depends on whose code you're working on and how well you know the language and the syntax and all of that stuff. But my point there is errors are not the end of the world. Errors are where we start our debugging journey and trying to figure out how the computer is telling us it's not working. I can tell you hands down the worst kinds of bugs or errors to fix are when there is no error message and it just goes, it's not working. It's like, well, could you tell me where it's not working or how it's not working? No, it's just not working. You're like, well, I've got all this code. How do I know where to start? And so hopefully the error will give you an error message. Susan, I'm guessing it said like unexpected parenthesis or missing closing curly brace or something like that.
It said something like waiting for changes, like it obviously wanted me to do something.
Did it have a message above the waiting for changes?
It actually says syntax error missing. If I had scrolled up, it says exactly what's missing.
And so
yeah,
when I push on you guys a little bit, that's why is getting the practice of reading those error messages, kind of understanding where they're at, and then trying to work through them a little bit. Carolyn, if you're getting NAN in your browser, I would recommend that you check the URL and make sure that you've got your URLs that are matching the query parameters in your code. So in my code, I was referencing, and let me just make sure this is what I pasted in. Yeah, it is. So in my code, I'm referencing first num and I'm referencing second num. And so over in my URL, I want to make sure that one, I've got the question mark. So the browser knows that query parameters are coming. I want to make sure that my parameter is called first num and that I've got an equal and then a number in there. And then I have an ampersand, say a second parameter is coming. And then I can say second num is equal to 4. Kind of interesting thing about query parameters. And I guess most data that you send to the server, unless it's in an array, the order doesn't matter. So I can actually take my first num is equal to 5 and cut that, make sure the question mark is still there, and say question mark second num is equal to 4, and then put my ampersand and my first num is equal to, I don't know, 10, and hit enter there, and I still get 14. So order of your query parameters, little fun fact, does not matter. All right, got 9 votes. One more person. Push me over the line. All right, got 10. All right, we're going to keep going. So we've got one more way that we're going to cover sending data to the server. There is at least one more way that I can think of in the headers, which is not particularly common unless you're dealing with like authentication of an API or something like that. And I am sure that there are many other ways. One thing I want to cover based off of a message that Gus sent is we are covering what is called REST APIs, right? Representative state transfer is what REST stands for. And it's basically this notion of someone's going to send a request asking for some data. We're going to send them a response back, and then that is it. If my server wants to then send some more information, it can't do it. Once the response is sent, that is it. It is gone. And so it is common to use something called polling, which is basically your front end saying, hey, do you have any data? And the server goes, no, you got it all. He goes, all right. And then 10 seconds passes or a minute passes, and the server goes, hey, do you have any data? And the server goes, no, I don't have any. And goes, okay. Hey, do you have any data? Oh, yeah, I've got a new message for you. And it sends it down. But with REST, which is the way the vast majority of the internet is built, the server cannot send information via a response without the request coming in from the front end to do that. So a common technique is to poll the server to continually ask it, hey, do you have any new information for me? And if you do, it shows up. That is, like I said, the way the vast majority of the internet is built. We are coming up on this new technology called sockets or web sockets. And the notion of a WebSocket is the browser can actually open a connection with the server and keep that connection open. And because that connection is open, the server can send information down to the client whenever it wants, down to the front end. And the front end can do the same thing in reverse. Because the connection's open, it has no problem sending some information up. Sockets are a little bit more complicated, both to kind of wrap your head around conceptually and also to program. Because you have to deal with things like what happens if the socket closes and we need to reopen that connection. We are reaching the point where most modern browsers support sockets. And if you build a modern chat app today, it would be built over sockets. So if someone sends you a message, that message is actually going up to the server. The server is then broadcasting it down to your front end that's connected, and you can see that message without the front end constantly asking. But that's one important thing to cover is we are creating what we would consider a RESTful API right now, right? The front end has to ask for some data in a request. We have to send some data back in a response, but there is no way for us on the server to send additional information down to that front end until it comes in with another request. So we're going to focus on building RESTful APIs. Based off of how much Gus covers with sockets, we may or may not be able to tack that on to the very end of the module in the last 2 weeks and do a quick little example of that. But because so much of the web is built on RESTful APIs, that's what we're going to be focusing on in this module, or at least this week. Okay, any questions before I keep going? Okay. Two-way communication, Shahil, is exactly what sockets are for. You are opening that socket connection, and then because that socket is open, you can send data back and forth without having the front end have to request it. Okay. Although you could argue that a RESTful API is two-way communication, right? Because we are requesting information and getting information back from the server. So it's just open two-way communication, either end being able to kick off that communication. Okay, so we talked about GET requests. GET requests are what we use on the internet and why we are able to go to our browser and type in a URL and get some information back. What is probably the second most common kind of request? Post. You guys got it. And what is special about post that we can't do with GET? It's used for changes or for updating data, sending data, pushing information. Yep. And where do we send that information that we want to update? We used root parameters and we used query parameters in our GET request. In our POST request, we get access to a third place we can send information. The body, Latonia, you got it. Props are only for React or only for HTML. So props are used for passing data around in React. We're trying to accomplish the same thing, but we don't call it props in HTTP. Alina, you mentioned database. That is where our end result, that's where our data will eventually end up. But we're kind of working with getting data to our backend server before we can get it into the database. And then Jahil, you mentioned JSON. JSON is the syntax that we will use in order to get that data up. And we'll kind of stumble into that as we go. Okay, so I am going to come down here and in my code, I am going to app. Instead of get, I'm going to now post. And I am going to post to add 3. And I am going to get my rec.res like I always do. And like I said, because I created a new endpoint, I'm going to res.send before I forget anything. And now two changes that I made. One, I am now app.posting instead of app.getting. And now down here, I am going to console.log my rec.body. And you can see we did our params up here first. These were our root parameters. Then we used rec.query to get access to our query parameters, which means it was a question mark, key name equals, and then whatever the value was. Now we are getting access to our body. But there's a problem here. I can only get in Chrome. When I type a URL in and I hit enter, it's doing a GET request. So what program did we use to practice our POST requests? Postman, you got it. So I'm going to pop open Postman. I'm going to make sure I don't have my answers loaded in to show you what we were working on. Clear this out. Okay. So you can actually see I've got some collections over here from what I use at work. So we actually document all the APIs we've created at work in Postman, and we are able to send our clients that documentation. So anyway, I'm going to come up here. I'm going to open up a new tab. If you have a bunch of old tabs open at the top, feel free to close them out, kind of have a clean workspace. And in my get, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change that to a post. And in my URL, I'm going to type in HTTP localhost 3000. And I'm going to do my /add3. And I'm going to try and split my screen here, hopefully. And let me see if I can blow this up and maybe close out of my collections or drag that over. Okay. So we've got our add. See if I can shrink this down anymore. No, it's going to make me scroll. Can I? No, it doesn't want to be that tiny. Okay, we'll deal with that. Okay, so I've got my console log rec.body, and I've got something sending back. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to hit send, and you can see error, cannot post add3. Okay, let's come back. Remember to save my code, which I promised you I'm going to forget to do 1,000 times. I'm going to hit send here, and I get nothing back. This is line number 1 that's showing up. So don't think that the server is sending back 1. And if I come over here, I get undefined. Well, that's kind of interesting. Let's just come in here and I'm going to send back ABC to make sure it's working. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to hit send. And you can see I got my ABC back, but my body is still undefined. Well, that's because in my Postman, if I go to my body's empty. And so there are all kinds of ways that we can send our data up to the backend. But with JavaScript and with most other backend languages, the standard way of doing it is sending some JSON up. So I'm going to click on raw here. And then in the text, I'm going to drop it down to JSON. And what that is basically going to do is tell the server, hey, I'm sending up some JSON. And technically under the hood, I believe that it does that in the headers, but I could be wrong. Maybe it doesn't. Anyway, I'm going to go back to my body. And because I picked JSON, I now need to write some JSON code in here. So remember that JSON is very similar to JavaScript objects, except we have to put the keys in quotes. So I'm going to put a quote here, and I'm going to say num1, and num1 is going to be 5. And I'm going to do a comma, and I'm going to say num2, and that's going to be 4. And I'm going to send that, and I get my ABC back. Okay, let's go back to our server, and we still get undefined. I'm going to save the code one more time and send it. We're still getting undefined. The reasoning for that is Node needs to be told, hey, when you get something in the body, be prepared to parse it. Be prepared to take that string and pull it apart. We need to use something to parse the body. So what we are going to do is I'm going to stop my server down here, and I'm going to install a package that probably has over 10 million weekly downloads, because it's always amazing that this is not built into Node. We are going to npm I, don't forget our -s because we want to save it, and we are going to install body parser with a dash in between. I'm going to hit enter there. It's going to take a second to install. I'm going to come back up to the top, and I'm going to say const body parser, and I'm going to camel case because I'm always a fan of camel casing, and I am going to require body parser. Now, I pulled in body parser, so NPM is giving it to me, but we've got to tell our Express app to use it. And so we are going to tell it to use body parser, and body parser can parse all kinds of data. It can parse your form data. It can parse all kinds of different ways of sending the syntax in. So we need to tell it to use .json, because that's the data type that we're sending our data in as. And so let me go through that one more time. I don't know why it's yelling at me. It's telling me it's depreciated. We're going to ignore that for now. So I'm telling app. What is app? Our app is our Express app or server, whatever way you'd like to think about it. And we're telling it to use it. Use is something called middleware. Middleware is exactly what it sounds like. It is running between the request coming in and your actual endpoint. So we are using body parser right in the middle. Middleware is a concept that I'm realizing now that because I'm teaching all 3 weeks of Node, that we are going to have to cover in week 2 or 3. So we're going to get into middlewares a little later. But the basic thing that you want to understand there is that we're saying, hey, use this in the middle between our request and our actual endpoint code running. And we are going to use body parser that we're pulling in from Express and say use the .json. So now I'm going to save that. I'm going to scroll back down here. I have my rec.body in. I'm going to come over to Postman and I'm going to hit send. And I get a nasty could not send request. Econ refused. Why am I getting an econ refused? Server is not running. You got it, Kyle. Whenever we install a package, we have to stop the server so we can install it. Now we've got to start the server back up. So I'm going to hit the up arrow twice on my keyboard to get my my npx Nodemon app.js. I'm going to run that. My server is up and running on 3000. I come over here. I hit send. I got my ABC back, but now let's come back over here. Look at what my rec.body is console logging out for me. I've got my num1 5 and my num2 4. And body parser is like, look, you're sending me JSON. There aren't quotes around those numbers in Postman. I'm not going to add quotes for you now. I understand you're sending me a number. I'm giving you right access to the number. So we don't have to do our parse int because the JSON has the syntax and knows that's a number coming in. So I'm going to come back down here, and instead of sending ABC, I'm going to grab my rec.body.num1. And because it is a number, because it is not in quotes in the object, I am able to grab my rec.body.num2, save that, come over here and send. And oh, I've got to send back a string because Express does not like me sending back just numbers. Okay, I get my 9. So what I did there is I didn't have to parse those numbers because the data coming in was already a string, but we're basically confusing Express a little bit by sending back only a number. And so that's why we send it back as a string instead, using the template literal, just like we did before. Now, one last concept I'm going to cover, and then I will stop and you guys can catch up. We're sending our data in as JSON, but so far we've only set strings back, right? Well, we can send back JSON just like we can receive JSON. And Express is going to have that magic built in for us. So we can actually send back an object and call it sum. And sum is going to send back our rec.body.num1 and our rec.body.num2. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to hit send, and I get my sum as 9. And we can even get fancier and say we can send back other data like string 2. And if we come over here and hit send, now not only did I get my sum, but I got my other data as well. Okay. Gonna give everyone a minute. Hopefully catch up on that. We want to make sure all 3 of our add methods are working. That will be the homework for tonight. So I'm going to give everyone a minute to catch up. And if anyone is feeling bold enough to kind of talk through line by line of the code, probably in particular these 3 and kind of what the differences are between them, I would encourage you to do that. Whenever someone is ready, unmute, take a stab at it. Otherwise, go ahead and work on getting your rec.body working. Carolyn, I already posted it into Slack for you.
So you're saying lines 15, 20, and 25?
Lines, more lines 10, 15, and 20. Basically the three different ways we got data, just talking through what you think that's doing.
Okay, so for the first one,
yep.
We're, I guess, using get to, I guess, get like a query or something.
In the second one, we're using query parameters. In the first one, we're going to use route parameters or route parameters.
Route parameters, okay.
And you can, 2 things that are kind of tipping you off to the fact that they're route parameters. One, this is the URL route, right? This is our endpoint route. So you can see that we added num1 and num2 in there. And the way that Express knows that they are those route parameters is because they've got a colon in front of them. And so because they've got the colon in front of them, Express, through its magic, is already dumping whatever is in num1 into this object rec.params, and the keys of those objects are going to match whatever is after the colons.
Oh, okay, I see. So like basically like in the URL, we're gonna have like a slash whatever, HTTP, whatever, localhost or something like that, /add. So yeah, and then so slash, well, yeah, 3000 or /add number num1 equals whatever /num2 equals whatever.
So we don't even need the equals.
Okay.
Because they're route parameters, the way Express knows that they are different is because of the slashes in between them. So basically this 5 is going to go into whatever num1 is, and this 6 is going to go into whatever num2 is. And so if we console log out, we're console logging num1, that would be 5.
Okay.
And then if we did a console log num2 or what we're doing in here, that would give us access to the 6.
Oh, okay. So like when we change like either the 5, that would become like a 10, and then num1 would be 10.
Correct.
And then, okay, I see. And then that's not really like data, like backend stuff or whatever.
This is the backend. All of this code is running in the backend. It's all running in a server. We're just showing 3 different ways that we can send some information from the front end up to the backend.
Oh, okay, I made a mistake. I meant to say like it's not stored.
Correct. We're not storing it. It's only stored as long as we're running inside this function. And as soon as we res.send, that's it. That information is gone and we can't get it back.
Okay, so it's like a local variable.
Yes. Yep.
Like okay, so it ends there. And then the second one would be, yeah, HTTP, yeah, /num1. All right, that's what we have. So first num and then /second num. Oh, and?
Yeah, so the query parameters are a little different. So the query parameters are going to use a question mark. And so the add to The root is just going to match up until the question mark. And then Express knows, hey, question mark means they're sending some data over a query parameter. By the way, it is possible to mix and match these, and we're going to actually show that in our chat app. We are going to use a root parameter for the ID that we're going to be sending back and forth, but we are going to use the post body to send the actual messages. And so what we're doing with the query parameters is we use a question mark, and that's how Express knows, hey, anything coming after this isn't going to be used for the routing. They're just trying to send some additional data. And so query parameters are interesting because it is a key and the value that we use. So the key is going to be first num here, and we use an equal sign, kind of like we use a colon in JSON or in a JavaScript object. And then we are going to add in whatever number we want. And then we are going to use an ampersand so it knows, hey, the next thing coming isn't part of first num anymore. It's another piece of data. It's another key value that we're sending. And we're going to send that with the key second num, and we're going to make that key equal to the value 3. Oh. And so in our code, we've got our rec.query, and then whatever we use here has to match whatever is coming in with a query parameter.
Cool. So the add, so the get that dot slash or whatever add to is basically like kind of like an I guess an object or something like that.
The rec.query is an object. The add to is what we call the root or the endpoint pass.
Okay, the endpoint pass. So what I meant by that was like, you know, in I guess JavaScript where we have an object, I guess, where we have like the keys or whatever.
Yep.
We have like a variable, like whatever, like it could be a constant, blank equals, you know, the curly braces, and then what's inside of it is the keys. So basically, like the variable name is essentially just the slash add to, and then the keys would be like first num and then second num.
No, the keys are first num, and then the values are 2 and 3.
Right. Okay.
And so you want to be careful saying that, because endpoints are meant for other people to be able to use them, right? You're trying to get your server to talk to your front end, but that may not be the case. You may be making an API so that other developers can interact with your server and your code. And so add to, no matter what programming language you're using on the back end, is always considered the root or the path or the location or the endpoint name or anything like that. And so the root is always kind of how the server knows what code to run. Now it is also possible, as we showed in our first example, that we can send some data in the root itself. And when we do that, we use the colons in the root in the first parameter for Express. But with the query parameters, the way React knows they are different, or I'm sorry, Express knows they are different, is because that question mark is there. So the question mark is telling Express the root is now over. The entirety of the root is add to. Now, anything that comes after that question mark are going to be key value pairs that are used for our get parameters. And so the key or the variable name kind of is going to be first name, and then the value of that parameter of that key is going to be 2.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I think I understand now. And then, so basically, like whatever that is, like the add to thing is kind of like a reference point.
Correct. Yep.
Right. That's what we're referring to. And then like from that, that's where we can get whatever we send through, whatever we're parsing it or whatever.
Correct.
Then, yeah, I see now.
Yeah. So what comes in front of the question mark is telling React which endpoint to run. It's saying, well, this one's called add, so I don't want to run that one. And this one's called add 3, so I don't want to run that one. So what I want to run is add 2. So Express, up until before the question mark, it's ignoring the question mark until it figures out which one of these 3 endpoints it should run. Now, after it sees the question mark, it goes, oh, there's some query parameters. There's some additional data coming in here. Let me pull that apart and make first num and second num keys in this object called rec.query, and their values are going to be 2 and 3. And we can prove that because we're console logging out our query, right? So if I pull this up and I go back to my browser and run add 2 second num 4 first num equals 10, and I hit enter, I get my 14. But if you look in the browser, it's sending me my second num and my first num.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is way where we covered 3 different ways of getting data to our server. The first way, we sent it right as part of the root, and it's able to pull that information apart because there's slashes in between it. And it knows to put it in num1 because in the root we did a colon and said num1. And so this rec.params object is going to look just like our rec.query here if we use num1 and num2 in our parameters, right? So the first way we send it in is with the root, and we send those numbers in just as num1 and num2. The second way we send it in is with query parameters, and we said we still got a match on the root, but anything after that question mark, I'm sending in some additional data so the add endpoint knows what to do. Then the final way we send it in is with the post body, right? And I can't really write just the URL for this because we sent some data with it. And so the data we sent was num1 and num2, and we sent it in as JSON. But when we send that JSON to Express, Express is like, whoa, that could be a string. You could be sending me data as XML. You could be, sending me 4,5. I have no idea what you're sending in. And so what we had to do is we had to npm install our body parser and then tell our Express app, hey, use the body parser to pull out the JSON. And as soon as we added that back in, now down here, all of a sudden, we've got access to rec.body, just like we had access to rec.query or rec.params.
Oh, okay, cool. And I want to see if I actually understand this. So like, does request or whatever, does request represent an object, right?
Request is a very big object. Yes, it has a ton of keys in it.
And in response, is that essentially kind of like a handler?
Yeah, the response is basically is Express telling us, hey, once you figured out what the response you would like to be is, we're going to give you access to this thing called send, and send is going to let you send the response.
Okay, I see now. So basically, we have the request, like within the parameters or whatever. That's essentially like the quote unquote big object.
Yep.
And the response is basically just the handler or event or whatever you like to call it. I don't know.
Yep.
And then we just use the quote unquote event dot send, and then we send whatever data that's within the request object.
In the what we want to send back in the response.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. What we want to send, whatever. And
so, Brandy, you asked what other data was. I just used that as an example to show that you can send multiple pieces of data back via JSON. So you could call this foo and bar if you wanted to. The idea behind this is that you can just see in Postman that we can actually send JSON back and send multiple pieces of data back. And not only can we use JSON to do that, we could even send back my array and send back pieces of data in an array as well. All right, I'm going to start the final poll for the evening just so I know where people are at. I will post this in the classroom. This will be the what you see is the homework assignment. You just want to get your ads working, all three of them. That will be the homework. Tomorrow we will start redoing our chat app in React, and we're going to get that all working in React. Then we're going to switch over and get all the endpoints created. And then once we get the endpoints created, we're going to go back to our React code and get our everything working over there. I can just. So if you got it working, go ahead and vote that you did. Otherwise, I will be around for the next 15 minutes to answer any questions. Nodemon server, most common reason it crashes is because you have a syntax error, or something is wrong with your code where it can't run. So when Nodemon says that it crashed, that's not actually the most helpful part. If you scroll up a little bit, it should tell you why it crashed, and that's where you want to start your debugging. Alina, for homework, I basically want you to have the 3 endpoints working. And so you'll have to use Postman to test the last endpoint. But the first 2 endpoints you can test either in Postman or the browser. But basically just don't submit the exact file, don't copy and paste it. But once you get all 3 of your endpoints working, submit your app.js file. And I will create the homework assignment for that and document that. Susan, if you're still having your error, feel free to unmute and shout out what the error is that you're getting. You're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. I was logged out of Postman. So when you were in the screen of Postman, I didn't see. I think I have.
Yep.
I saw you said the raw and the JSON, and now am I supposed to put something in the body there or no?
Yeah. So in the body, go ahead and write out your JSON.
Okay.
And so it's going to be curly brace, quote, num1, close quote, colon, and then the number. And then you want to add your num2 there. And then one thing to point out, make sure that not only do you have it on raw, but you change this drop down to JSON, because that's not only telling Postman to help with your syntax highlighting. I'm pretty sure it's also telling Express to expect some JSON coming in. Let me test that.
Okay. Oh, and
yeah, so if you just set it to text, notice our sum just became null. And so by setting this text down to JSON, it's telling Express, hey, remember that body parser thing that we used? Yeah, you need to use that because what's getting sent in is JSON. So that's an easy thing to forget and an important thing to set.
okay. And now, yeah, could not send request, cloud agent error, cannot send request to a localhost, select a different agent, use Postman's desktop agent.
Go ahead and share your screen. I wonder if your URL isn't right.
Okay, hang on.
Oh, and don't forget, if you guys are still here, to fill out the daily feedback form. Karen, if you can drop that link in the chat, that would be appreciated. Okay, so the problem is that you're using the web version of Postman, and the web version of Postman doesn't like sending requests to localhost. So you're going to have to install Postman on your computer, and that should be it.
Oh, this is it down here. That's weird. When we use it with Ryan, it used to auto open. I didn't realize.
I didn't even know they had a web only version. So you learn something new every day.
Yeah.
And if you go, you're going to have to sign back in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be able to figure it out now if it was just that was the issue. Yeah, thanks.
No, that's a good thing to share your screen, because there are all kinds of security precautions about websites not being able to access things on your local computer. And so that's what Chrome is protecting you from in Postman, is accessing things on a website that you shouldn't be able to access through the web. And we will be talking about a way to get around that probably on Wednesday. Karen just posted the daily feedback form. Any feedback you have, not only for me, but also for if you have any comments about the presenter, if you enjoyed that presentation, any feedback if they came back next cohort, that kind of stuff. Feel free to include that all in the notes section of the daily feedback form. And a reminder on that, I know I sent out a Slack message, but daily feedback form does not have to be filled out right at the end of class. If things are still soaking in, if you'd rather do that tomorrow, that is completely fine. We're not, we're not dictators here saying you got to fill it out as soon as class is over. If you would like to fill it out tomorrow, that is completely fine. And I will be here if anyone has questions. Otherwise, I am going to create the assignment on Google Classroom and get the code in the repo.
Did you see Kyle's comment in the chat?
Kyle, go ahead and share your screen.
Which one? The postman?
We'll start there and then go to your code second.
Share screen.
Yep. What I thought, you need to change your text to JSON.
Oh, okay.
And while you're in there, num1 and num2 that aren't valid JSON, that is valid JavaScript, but not valid JSON. So you just need to throw your num1 and num2 in quotes.
Oh, okay. Oops.
Boom.
Thanks.
Hey Max, I know that you already went through this, but the power went out, or where I was I guess driving from, like in Geneva or whatever, like and I needed gas for my car, but I guess the gas machine thing wasn't working because the power was off or whatever. So then I had to drive all the way down to like a different interstate or whatever in Waterloo. So like I was still, I was listening to the course or whatever, but at the same time, didn't have access to a computer.
Sure.
So I was just trying to use the time to catch up, but I still didn't catch up all the way. I'm stuck at like trying to, I guess, start the server.
Okay. Can you share your screen now?
Yeah, let me, here we go. Share screen. Okay.
Control C there.
Control C.
C. Yep. Okay. So that gets you out of your server. Let's run a PWD just to make sure you're at the right spot. And then an LS. Okay. So you've got your package.json, which means your npm and init worked. If you just do a node space index.js.
Oh.
Maybe. Oh, okay. That file looks like it was deleted. Let's make sure we've got the right index.js open.
Right, let me rename it back to app. I was just reading the documentation. There we go.
Okay, so everything looks good up until the yeah, just delete that out, and we're going to do an app.listen. You were on the right track in your code. Yep. Just move your arrow function needs to be between the two closing parentheses. Yep, and then your curly brace console log, that needs to be after the arrow, but yeah, you got it. And then just console log out like a number there instead. No, hold on. Trying to do too much here. First, let's fix your indentation, because I think you yep. Let me I think I can just hit open system. Yeah, hit open system preferences there. Hit the lock in the bottom left. Type in your Mac password. And then just check off Zoom. Perfect. And I should be able to. Okay, so we want to clean up our indentation here just so we understand what's running where. Okay, so now we should be able to see 3000 is our port that we're listening on. And then we want some code to run when the app has started to listen. So in here, we're just going to say server started on 3000 and save that. And now down here, I'm going to run my node app.js. And not only did we get our console log test, we also got that the server has started. So you have your hello endpoint in here. So all we need to do is go to localhost 3000/hello, and there's your hello world.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
I'll just start going back now.
Max, I got the first two to run. The third one's tricky. I think I probably just need to rewatch the video when it's available.
It should actually be available now. If you go back to the live stream, you should be able to rewind it.
Yeah, because it's different, but I'm probably making it harder than it is. So let me see if I can figure it out then.
Okay.
Any hints?
I would say you want to be careful about when you're asking for help, right? So only ask for help if you're stuck.
No, I was kind of kidding, but we're good. Thank you.
No problem. If you have it all running, feel free to drop out. I'll stick around for another couple minutes in case anyone has questions. Kyle, you've angered the NPM gods. As long as your code is running, I wouldn't worry too much about it. The reason I'm confused is add server does follow the conventional pattern. Maybe it doesn't like the capital S. Maybe because node packages maybe have to be all lowercase, or they, not sure. I wouldn't worry too much
Can
about
I
it.
just change it there? Do I have to change the name of the folder? No, it doesn't matter what the name of the folder is, right?
You should be able to just change it there and the error
Yeah.
should go away.
Okay,
But I
thanks.
think that's more of a warning than an error, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. I would worry about it if you were like submitting your code to NPM and publishing it, but outside of that, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, Fabria.
You're right. It didn't like the capital. I was just trying to make everything match, but that's okay. Thanks.
See you lurking, Latonia. I know you've got a question.
I refuse to ask any more questions until the next time we meet one-to-one.
Fair enough. Shaw or Mel, if you have any questions, fire them off now. Otherwise, I'm going to drop out of here. Awesome. Well, have a good night, guys. I will see you tomorrow.